everyone, and before we get to the second part of the mileage that you would want to do during your general preparation cross-country season, I want to come back to this. We talked about this in a couple of videos, and I do want to thank everybody who has hit the subscribe button since then. When I first started pointing out the numbers, when I noticed the amount of views for subscribed versus not subscribed, it was something like 70% of the people who were watching my videos were not subscribed, and we have almost turned that completely on the other side now. About a month later, we're at 60% of the views on my videos are from people who are subscribed and about 40% not subscribed, which thank you very much for those of you that have hit the subscribe button. But if you are still watching this and you are in that 40%, I would really appreciate if you gave it a subscribe. It really does help the channel just grow and recommends to other people that are searching for more similar topics to also have it appear in their feed. So if you are watching this, have seen videos before, and you're finding them helpful, please hit that subscribe button. It certainly doesn't. All it does is help the channel by showing your support for it. So if you are in that position, thank you very much. If you have hit subscribe, and if you haven't, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Hi everyone, and welcome back to this part 2 of the videos we did on mileage during general preparation phase as part of a bigger video series on setting up your cross-country macrocycle in the general prep phase. In this video, we're going to look at the breakdown of the miles that you might be running during general prep. In part 1, we just talked about total volume, focusing on central VO2 max, just bulk miles and that kind of thing, what makes sense in terms of total miles per week. If you didn't see that video, it's in the description down below. I would recommend looking at that one first because it's kind of a stepping stone to what we're looking at here when we look at the actual mileage breakdown. What we're really looking at here is what's the right mix of miles for success in the cross-country 5K in relation to general preparation phase, right? Because that's what we're really dealing with here, your summer training. And what are the traits that are needed and in what ratio? So we're going to look at basically those traits for cross-country. We're going to look at that actually first and then look at the right mix. This is our 2018 boys cross-country team. I say varsity team here because it was right after our final VO2 max test from general prep that year. I used that to set our varsity lineup. So this was our varsity 7 going into that year. This group was the group made it back to the state meet for the 3rd straight year. I talked about in previous videos, in 2016 we made it to the state meet for the first time in 7 years, and we're currently on, thankfully, a 4-year stretch because of the dedication of young men like who you're seeing right here, the varsity 7, and that group pretty much was the 7. There was a little bit of fluctuation, but for the most part that was our 7. It was because these guys did everything in general prep in terms of the miles and also the mileage breakdown, the ratio that year. So that's what you kind of want. Those kids that do everything during the summer are typically the ones that are going to be there at the end of the season at that point, because it is really about building those qualities over time, especially with the aerobic system. I am Kyle LaGiacono. I'm the head boys cross-country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida, and I have been for the last 7 years. Some of my credentials are on the screen if you'd like to take a closer look. Alright, so as always, we want to make sure we know what the metrics of the race are. Looking at the 5K, if we were dealing with some other race, 10K, half marathon, 400, whatever, the metrics would be different, and therefore what we're shooting for in terms of developing traits or adaptations would be different. So let's look at this. Race Predictor, a kind of breakthrough study that was released in 2008 by Ingham. It was looking at what was the traits that most accurately predicted who won a race. And when they looked at the 5K, it was as close to a sure thing as you have in racing. Whoever had the best VO2 max won 94.3% of the races, or basically who could run the fastest aerobically. The idea being of it being aerobically with the distance of the race, that's probably the reason why this is so close. Now, there's obviously variation here. People can still go out too fast even if they have the tools, race tactics and things like that, but that's about as close as you can get to a sure thing in racing. And the reason why that's probably the case, we can look at from the USATF distance curriculum race-specific VO2 max. I'm looking at the percentage of VO2 max that you run different races in. And when we look at the 5K from this distance curriculum from USA Track and Field, we'll find that the 5K is run at 97% of VO2 max. VO2 max is basically your 2-mile pace. It's very close to that. That's why the 2-mile is basically the best test for it. There's a little bit of variation there, but that pretty much is why it's run obviously a little bit slower because it's longer, but because it's so close to VO2 max pace, that's probably why you have that indicator of such high success because of that particular metric. And then this race energy supply share from from Dr. Matter and Dr. Hartman in 2018, still a very, very new study, but it was very groundbreaking in that it looked at where the energy was coming from the three main resuppliers of ATP in all humans, as a kind of second-by-second look within different dimensions of various paces. It wasn't just, you know, some of the older studies, they would measure lactate after, say, a 400, and that's how they did it. This kind of does like a snapshot during the actual intensities to look at it. So they found that 4% came from the, what's kind of collectively called the alactic energy system, which is the ATP, and the phosphocreatine system, 4%. Anaerobic glycolytic is 4%, and then the aerobic system, not surprisingly from this race, the 5K, 86% of the energy is coming from that. Makes perfect sense, and that is at race pace. If you walk a 5K, it's going to be almost 100% aerobic with very little coming from the other ones. All the energy systems are all on at the same time. It's just sort of how much they're on, and at 5K success, this is sort of the breakdown of it. Alright, so I've talked about this in some previous videos, I think specifically when we talked about tempo running in general prep, and we talked about law of specificity. Okay, I don't want to get too bogged down on training theory, but essentially, law of specificity has to be considered in everything that you do when you're training yourself or training somebody else for this reason. The law of training specificity says that every training session has a specific effect on the athlete. If you do workout A, you're going to have result A in whoever's being trained. You do workout B, it's going to have B effect in whoever it is you're training. Or having no training, having a rest day, that's going to have a specific effect. That's the idea, is whatever you do, it's going to create a specific effect. If you do workout A, you're probably not going to get effect B if those workouts are different. If they're the same workout, they wouldn't be called something different, obviously. But that's the idea, is whatever you're doing is creating that specific effect in the athlete, or it's going to create a specific adaptation in that athlete. That's the first part, but most importantly, which may or may not be desired for that event. So the idea being is just because you're training doesn't mean you're getting better. Typically the first year running, any type of running gets you better, right? It doesn't really matter what it is because you've never done it before, so you don't have to get so specific. But especially as you get to somebody that you've trained for a year or 2 or 3 years, people have been running for a very long time. I've been running for more than half my life. I'm 33 years old, so this kind of is where I am. If I just go out and run, I'm not really going to change anything with me at this point because I'm used to running on an everyday basis. If I want to actually improve my fitness, I have to be more specific with it. So just keep that in mind. You might be looking at this being like, well, that doesn't really make sense because I've got this kid as a freshman and they made this huge growth. But then look at it if you're doing the same thing, not really specifically training them in year 2 or year 3. Are they still having those kind of positive growths? Probably not as big in the first year no matter what you do, but the idea being is you need a more specific tailored approach, especially the more trained you get, and this law of training specificity really is the reason for that. So what we need to consider while keeping this law of training specificity in mind is what is the best ratio for volume for success in cross-country 5K. In the last video, we looked at just total volume, what was best for success. Now we're looking at the ratio. What types of miles should we be doing and what kind of ratio for success in the cross-country 5K? So that's kind of our guiding principle of how are we breaking this down with that law of specificity in mind. All right, so what are the aspects or the traits of that we're trying to get from either yourself or whoever you're training in the general preparation cross-country part of the year, the training for this? So there are basically 4 main ones that we really are trying to deal with here at this part of the year. And central VO2 max improvements are the first one. This is really what the first video, part 1 of this, was about. If you didn't see it, it's in the description down below. Central VO2 max improvements, generally, it's basically done with general aerobic work, any general aerobic work, done for at least 20 continuous minutes. Doesn't have to be at aerobic threshold, and I talk about how this can actually be semi-continuous work in the previous video with intervals and things like that. But we usually think about it more with aerobic threshold. That's your 65 to 70% VO2 max, your long run and your recovery. But anything that's generally aerobic, that is for 20 continuous or very near 20 continuous minutes, is going to improve this. This generally improves as the body increases the ability to move oxygen from the heart outward. So if you think about the heart as this central part of central VO2 max, how can we get the most oxygen moved outward from the heart to improve your body's maximum ability to use that oxygen? If we're not moving it from the heart outward, then we're not able to use it. So this is sort of the first step in these aspects of general cross-country training, or the traits we're trying to get. Peripheral VO2 max is the next step. So we've gotten it away from the heart, away from the center. Now, how can the working muscles actually use it? At the periphery or the extremities of your body. And this is improved with aerobic power, VO2 max. You hear me use those interchangeably. VO2 max is right at 100%, your 2-mile pace. Aerobic power is a slightly bigger range, 98 to 101%. Aerobic power work, it's done only at that range. If you're not running 98 to 101% of your VO2 max, you're not going to be improving your peripheral VO2 max. In the videos on intervals, VO2 max intervals in the description down below, I talk about this in detail. If you don't want to take my word for it right now, I would recommend looking at that if you haven't already. This generally improves as the body increases the ability of the working muscles to extract oxygen from the blood for use in the mitochondria. Okay, so we've improved our central VO2 max, we've moved a lot of oxygen away from the heart, but if your working muscles, in this case your legs, are not able to use it, it doesn't matter how much oxygen we can use. Your body builds a structure called myoglobin, which is what, it sounds a lot like hemoglobin. Hemoglobin holds the oxygen on your blood, and then the working muscles, the way I think about this is it's like it's in oxygen debt or it's close to be, it needs the oxygen, it basically tells the blood it's mine from the myoglobin that pulls it off of the working muscle, off of the blood into the working muscles, and that's what's improved in large part from peripheral VO2 max improvements with aerobic power type work. So those are the first things, and so these are the two ways that we can improve VO2 max: central VO2 max, the moving of oxygen, and the peripheral VO2 max, the working at the working muscles to extract oxygen from the blood for use in the mitochondria. This is that 94.3% wind indicator. This is sort of the first part, and we really want to look at these things as we go through and how the mile ratio kind of breaks that down. But it's not the only thing that we need to deal with. We also need to look at things like running economy. This is still important for the 5K. Now, this is going to vary a little bit by athlete when we get to the target range here. Any general aerobic work improves running economy. Okay, you go out and you do a 20-minute recovery run. Yeah, it's central VO2 max, and the act of just running is going to get you some running economy. But it is best done with lactic threshold for a couple of different reasons that are being improved with. Okay, lactic threshold is about 85% of current VO2 max. In the video that we have in the description down below on tempo running, I talk about how it's different. You have somebody who's very new to running. Then that's probably, they don't have the infrastructures in place aerobically. Theirs is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be much lower intensity. Maybe it's closer to maybe 78% or so, closer to their aerobic threshold, which is 65 to 70%. Or you might have somebody that just because of their the uniqueness of themselves, or they're just really well trained, might be closer to 90%, even maybe 92% if they're just completely amazing aerobically. So this is sort of it can't be a 100% measure, but the idea being very close to this lactic threshold is going to improve running economy a little bit better than just any type of general running. This generally improves as the body uses the least amount of energy to move. You get from point A to point B with the least amount of energy. And a lot of times that's when people think, wait a second, shouldn't that be what I'm dealing with more than VO2 max? If I'm using the least amount of energy, isn't that the sort of the key? Not really. In the 5K, which is what this whole video series is about, what we need to really sort of think about is, I mean, if you go and you run a 5K as, all-out race pace, the amount of calories you're going to use is between 300 and 400. That's like a granola bar. That's less than a candy bar. It's not a lot of energy. You're not going to be better than somebody else in the 5K based purely on if both people have the most fuel stores. Now, if you go into that race without enough fuel, that's a different thing. But truly running economy is only a small aspect of it, but it is an important aspect, otherwise we wouldn't be dealing with it at all. So just keep that in mind. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people overdo tempo runs or lactic threshold runs, because of this idea of running economy. But in reality, we need to go faster for success in the 5K, and VO2 max is a much faster pace, so that's why it's so important to improve these different things. But it is so important. It does include several aspects I've already alluded to, such as fuel stores. It's also muscle elasticity. We talk about in the videos on hill runs, short hill intervals, and alactic runs in the description down below. You can actually get free energy from muscle elasticity. That's free energy as your muscles spring back, their plyometric qualities, elastic strength. Free energy, so if we're getting free energy with every step, that's also based on improving running economy. So there is aspects of the other two other types of workouts I'm going to talk about in a second here, but that's the idea of running economy. It's typically looked at with lactic threshold. And then specific strength. Specific strength to this event. different than success in the 100 or the high jump or, you know, the javelin throw or whatever. But what kind of specific strength are we trying to do within cross country? And the two type of workouts that I think are really important in general prep: hill runs, typically done as short intervals. This improves muscle elasticity and force production. And then alactic runs, typically as flies, to improve muscle coordination and synchronization. How can you improve the most force? So things for like kicking, when you have people passing each other at the end of a race, why are some people doing better at that than others? It's because of force production, muscle elasticity, which also has to do with running economy, so there is some crossover here. And the idea being is if your muscles are more coordinated and synchronized as they're firing, you're going to be able to increase more force production. So this is sort of that last bit, who can outkick the other people at the end, and this is an important quality for who wins, who comes in second or third. You know, a lot of times you'll see this in a cross-country race. You'll have a group of about 4 or 5 people kind of going to the finish, and one or maybe 2 of them just take off and the other ones just can't do it. The specific strength is lacking, but maybe these other things were here with these other ones. So that's why these are the 4 things that you want to deal with. These are the most important. This is what, you know, puts you really in your positioning. This can also help out with that. And then this is how you get there at the very, very, very end. This is what gets you there. This is what keeps you there in your position as people are kicking at the end. So how can we actually break this down? What ratio of these things should we have in general prep? Okay, but that always brings up the question, but wait a second, shouldn't we just focus on miles? That's what a lot of people say, and in the video we talked about in part 1 about total mileage, you know, a lot of people are just like, I want the most miles. I want to run 500 miles in the summertime if I'm getting a kid ready for cross-country, high school, or whatever. And, you know, miles are important. They're a way of measuring things, but they're not the end-all and be-all, and I think I might be able to convince you of that if you're one of those purely mileage people here in 1 second. Miles are an indicator, but all they really give you is a number to track. How many miles I ran this week versus last week and what I plan to run the next week and maybe total at the end. This is what I think a lot of coaches like to talk about the most when we just kind of get together and swap stories. You get asked, how many miles a week are you running? Along with what's your warm-up and your cool-down? And also probably what do you do in your peaking period? Those are probably the biggest things that are discussed. And I mean, yeah, it's interesting to know what another coach does, but, you know, I'm more interested maybe in why a coach might have the mileage that they do. In the video, part 1 of this, I talked about how when I started going to a couple different trainings, how I decided I needed to increase my miles. But I didn't just go from, you know, one part of miles per week to another. I really thought I knew I had to get from it over 2 years to a point where I thought it was going to be best at the end when we got to that, you know, end of that journey. So it wasn't something I just did all of a sudden. So, you know, miles are important, but just because one group is running 60 miles a week doesn't mean they're getting better training and will do better than a group that's running 45 miles a week that maybe have a different ratio and a better understanding of why they're doing things as they're getting into their general preparation part of the season. All right, I just threw a lot on the screen here, and I promise I will break it all down. There is also evidence that if you only focus on aerobic threshold or easy pace runnings we've talked about, just central VO2 max runs, you can stunt or regress in beneficial adaptations. That seems like it's impossible. How can that be? Especially for people that have been running for a while, this can happen. As a distance runner myself, I love just going out and doing long, slow distance. It's what we sort of gravitate to as endurance-type runners. But that's not the only thing. You need to look at other aspects of it. And let's see how this kind of breaks down and how it can actually stunt your growth if you only focus on that. I don't know how to pronounce this, the author of the study's name, but here it is. It was first produced in 2007. There's other studies that have found similar results, but this was kind of the first one that looked at this. The name of the study is Aerobic High-Intensity Intervals Improve VO2 Max More Than Moderate Training. This should already be a clue here. Well, this is improving something. This is the key indicator of who's going to win in it. So if you, I'll kind of break down what they did and what the findings were, but if you want to look at it yourself, here it is. And again, there are other studies that have found it subsequently. So what this study did was they took 40 healthy, moderately trained men for 8 weeks. 40 for a human study is pretty good. That's a pretty decent size case study. Whenever you're dealing with studying people, it's inherently hard to do, just for the mere fact that, you know, people don't necessarily like to get studied. It's harder to do this, and especially when you're just dealing with something like this that's trying to get an aerobic workout indicator. It wasn't meant to eventually sell a drug or something like that. So funding for studies like this is sometimes hard to come by because there's not going to be a payoff at the end. So 40 is actually pretty decent, and I think it's important to note here, we're dealing with moderately trained. So these are not brand new people, but they're also not elites. Okay, so if you're dealing with maybe a cross-country high school group, or maybe yourself, who's someone that's doing a decent amount of training, or maybe you've got a group that's pretty good, they've been running with you or all together for a couple of years, this is probably very indicative of your group here too. It was men, only men in the study, so take that for what it's worth. And it's 8 weeks. We've talked about previously, for maximum adaptation of an aerobic system, you need 20 plus weeks. So this was less than half of that. So what we're looking at here, it's less than half of what you would need to peak an aerobic system, so also keep that in mind. The total weekly volume was the same for all 40 people. I think they were running about 40 miles per week, if I remember correctly, in this. But they were randomly placed into 4 different groups based on workout types. So we had a long, slow distance groups only. They ran these, all of them ran 6 times a week. Group 1 ran only long, slow distance. Their indicator for long, slow distance was 70% max heart rate. A little bit different than what we dealt with previously when you said aerobic threshold is 65 to 70%. So a little bit different, but that's the best comparison here. We've got lactic threshold runs 3 times a week. And that was defined as 85% max heart rate. Not VO2 max, but max heart rate. But this is what they were considering lactic threshold. And then they were also doing 3 times a week long, slow distance. They were getting half of what this group was with this added stimulus. Then group 3 was doing a 15-15-second interval. Basically, 15 seconds fast, 15 seconds of recovery jog was their workout. And the fast part of that was 90 to 95% max heart rate. Okay, and the other 3 workouts were also long, slow distance. And then we've got group 4, which was doing 4 minutes, 4 times 4-minute intervals. They had active recovery in between, 4 minutes rest. They were fast for 4 minutes, recovery for 4 minutes. And this group was doing it, again, 90 to 95%. So the intensity between group 3 and group 4 was the same, but how they were getting it was different. This was much more continuous in nature than right here, along with times 3 long, slow distance. So what were the findings here? After 8 weeks, group 4 had the largest average increase in VO2 max. It was 7.2% after only 8 weeks. That's pretty good, because if you were kind of keep doing this to peak it, you would get potentially double that, or maybe even a little bit more double that. We're looking for 20 plus weeks to peak an aerobic system. Group 3 had the second most improvements, 5.5%. So that's still pretty decent, but they got almost 2% better. So if we think back to the idea that VO2 max is the biggest indicator for success, if group 3 and group 4 came into this training exactly the same VO2 max, everybody in group 4, for the most part, 94.3% of them should be ahead if they were to run a 5K ahead of group 3, because of that indicator of VO2 max improving that much more from group 4 to group 3. Okay? Now, here's the really interesting thing. Let's look at group 2 and group 1. Group 2 had no improvement in their VO2 max. There was a net gain in this indicator, which, as we said, is the biggest indicator for success in the 5K, of 0. After 8 weeks of lactic threshold times 3, long run times 3, 0 improvements. And even more interestingly, group 1 was slightly worse than when they started. Now, it was very small. It was less than a quarter of a percentage point, minus 0.2% of their VO2 max. And even the study said that was not statistically significant. But the fact of the matter is, this group these 10 got slightly better, or we could say that definitely these 2 groups did not improve at all. So these 2, the long, slow distance and the lactic threshold, no better after 8 weeks of training under this protocol. Okay? So the interesting thing there to kind of take away from it, and I think what's really important here, is because these were moderately trained. They came in already with an aerobic base, an aerobic background of some kind. Now, I think if I remember correctly, yeah, this group, in the study, they weren't bedridden, but they were basically told to stop training for, I think it was a period of 3 or 4 weeks prior to it. So they were pretty much coming in, not at no train, but they'd still, from their lifetime of running, they had built up some infrastructures because they were moderately trained. And this is the key thing. So a lot of times you'll have people their first year running say, oh, I had a freshman and we were just kind of running pure miles and they got this much better. Yep. because they had not built up any infrastructure at all aerobically. But as you get year to year better, this is the idea that as a person improves aerobically, you have to get more specific with their workouts, right? So again, you might have that kid that comes in as a freshman, you know, maybe they were a soccer player or hadn't done very much, and by the end of the season they were really, really good because naturally they were an aerobic type athlete. Yes, any type of running, just long, slow distance all day is going to get them better for maybe that first year. But they might come back in year 2 and you might think, all right, I'm going to do the same thing with them, and they just don't get nearly as good. Everyone's going to get better in their first year of running, obviously. But how do you keep pushing that improvement year after year after year? And it's from things like this, looking at the specific nature of it. I myself, so I've been running for more than half my life. I'm 33 years old. If I just go out and I do long, slow distance all day long, I'm not going to get any better probably either, because I've been running for so long at this point. I've built up all those infrastructures that just general running is not going to get me any better. If I want to get better, I have to look at the specific ratio of the miles, and I think that this study really should show you that. So again, with maybe your JV, your first year kids, don't worry about this so much, but your varsity kids, your top end group, or yourself, if you want to, or if you're trying to push yourself to that next level and you've been running for a while, this are the types of things you need to consider. And so the idea being is, where's the breakdown here of this as you're actually looking at it? So keep that in mind. If you are just focusing on miles and you're just doing long, slow distance, if you're dealing with kids that have been running, or yourself have been running for, say, more than a year or two, you're putting yourself in this group 1 that got slightly worse after 8 weeks of training. Okay, now maybe after 20 plus weeks, group 1 and group 2 would have gotten maybe a little bit better, but again, I think because they were moderately trained, just these things is not going to be enough of a training stimulus. It's not fast enough to do it. It's not going to get all the adaptations you want from the adaptations that you need. Now, I think it's really good that this study did this, that these were the same intensity, but how they gave it to people were different. The fact that this was only for 15 seconds, and then this was 4x4. Group 4 had the hardest workouts, obviously. 4x4 minutes at this intensity is much harder to do than 15 seconds. This is easier, but again, if you want to get better, you want it to be in group 4, even though this is the hardest workout, because they got 2% better in their VO2 max than group 3. So again, that also shows, I think, why you need to do these sort of continuous 4x4 minutes. That's right in the wheelhouse for a pretty good VO2 max aerobic power workout. Video in the description down below on VO2 max intervals talks about this a little bit more detail, but that's a really good, especially starting point for aerobic power type work. So I hope that kind of gets you out of that mindset of just focusing on miles and how we kind of figure out what a good ratio is. Okay, so we need to look at the ratio of miles, not just the total volume, to be sure, so that we do not just default. I mean, as a distance runner, we're all going to want to default to long, slow distance. It's what we're good at. Aerobic athletes are going to want to do this. The long run days are our favorite days. Recovery runs are great. But we have to get out of just looking at this to build those other infrastructural properties, those other adaptations to get the right, based on getting the right mileage ratio to have success in this race. Okay, so with all that in mind, we have to kind of figure out what is the best mileage ratio. And unfortunately, there aren't studies that have really necessarily looked at that, and I think it's probably going to be almost impossible to do that because it's really specific to your situation, to the athletes themselves. What's going to be right for somebody in their second year running is going to be different than their fourth year running, and all those different things. But I think really a good way to look at this comes from one of who I would call the fathers of distance running, and that is Dr. Jack Daniels, and he has written on this topic in his book, Daniels Running Formula. I would highly, highly recommend reading that book if you haven't. One of the things I absolutely adore about that book is the emphasis on knowing your why each day. Dr. Jack Daniels really says that if you're going out and if you don't know what your why is, you need to go back to the drawing board, and I think that's really critical. If you don't know why you're doing a workout, you really need to go back and reevaluate. Never focus on the what, always focus on the why, and if you do that, you're probably going to be in really good good shape with whatever you're doing, not just in running, but in anything in life. So I would highly recommend reading Daniel's Running Formula if you have not. So in that book, he advocates for the following breakdown on miles. He wasn't necessarily doing it on a week. He was talking about not having a particular workout type mileage exceed more than a percentage of your weekly mileage, okay? But I think we can sort of extrapolate from this based on some of the things that we've talked about already. So, In his book, he calls tempo running. It's the same thing as lactic threshold. If you read the book, it's the same workout intensity. These workouts should not make up more than 10% of your miles per week. So if you go out and you are, say, running 40 miles a week, your tempo run, that one tempo run should not be more than 4 miles of tempo, because that's 10% of your miles per week. Okay? Now, again, he doesn't advocate for how many of those tempo runs per week. I've talked about that in videos on each of these types on tempo, VO2 max intervals, and these different things. But in that one workout, that's sort of his indicator. Nothing more than that. He doesn't say you have to reach that level. That is the maximum extent. Should not make up more than 10% of your miles per week. Now, for intervals, in his intervals, he is actually talking about VO2 max aerobic power. If you look at the book, that's the workout type he's talking about. So here's your running economy workout. Here is your peripheral VO2 max workout. Should not make up more than 8% of the miles per week. So again, if you go out and you're running 40 miles per week and you do 4 times mile repeats, you have broken this parameter that Dr. Jack Daniels has come up with. Now, you might have a reason for that. That's perfectly fine, but just understand that's where this sort of percentage is coming into as you're looking at this. Now, repetitions, he's basically talking about anaerobic glycolytic workouts, or things faster than VO2 max when he's talking about repetitions in his book. And these workouts, he said, should not make up more than 5% of your miles per week in any one get-go. He does not specifically talk about hills or fly 30s, but I think we can extrapolate where this fits in. You probably already can figure it out based on this. If you do each of these workout types, 1 per week, which I think is highly recommended based on not only this, but also talked about in previous videos in the description down below on planning out your general preparation phase, that leaves you, if you add all this up, with 77% of your miles for aerobic threshold, warm-up, cool-down. That's at the lowest end. So if you go at the maximum end here, a workout of 10%, 8%, 5%, your aerobic threshold should be no less than 77%, essentially, if you kind of make all that math work out. So that's aerobic threshold, your recovery runs and your long runs, also your warm-up runs, your cool-down runs, your active recovery in between your intervals or your repetitions. I kind of call these ancillary miles or other miles, but it could be more. Again, this is the top end that you would not want to go more than. All right, so we have the beginning of looking at what a ratio could be. Okay, that's the framework I use. Okay, so if you want to make your own framework, take that, use it, great. You know your why way better than I ever could. To give you some insight into how I have used that to create my own framework when I'm used for setting up ideal mileage. Here's how I do it. In general prep, actual repetitions or anaerobic glycolytic work is not happening due to the peaking window of this system. We've talked about this extensively in the previous videos, in the description down below, pretty much all of them. The anaerobic glycolytic system takes 9 to 11 weeks to peak, and the aerobic system takes 20 plus weeks. So basically twice as long as the anaerobic glycolytic system, but we want them to both peak at the same time. General prep is about those aerobic qualities that we're dealing with mostly. There's other things that are going on, specific strength in general, and to name one. Anaerobic glycolytic work is not happening, so that's the 5% here, okay, that peaking system. We don't want this to peak before the aerobic system does. So what I do is I lump strength runs, your hills and your fly 30s, into the repetitions category for a couple of reasons. Yes, they're doing specific strength, okay, but in the videos I did on short hill intervals and alactic work in the description down below, they're also serving to not get you too far away from from speed type workouts in this part of the year when you're doing a lot of aerobic work, but you're not going to accumulate any acid with a fly 30 or hill work or any of that stuff. So that's why I lump this into the repetitions category when I'm looking at the breakdown of miles. So we've got, or at least the way I do it, you can do it however you want, where our repetitions are no more than 5% is going to come from. So my guide, all that sort of taking into account, is right here. When I'm dealing with aerobic threshold and ancillary miles that we talked about, I try and shoot for 75 to 85%. There's a pretty big window here. I'm almost always over 80%. Sometimes there might be something weird where I've got, you know, a hill run and an alactic run in the same week where I've also kind of pushed the tempo or the intervals where it might get a little bit below. But that's sort of like my danger sign. If I'm below that, then I know I have to kind of go back and reevaluate it. I didn't do something right when I was planning out the workouts. But typically, I'm right in around, low to mid 80% on this. I like to add a lot of long cooldowns and things like that to also keep my total miles at a point where I sort of want it to be for central VO2 max development. So usually that's not the issue for anything. I like to keep my lactic thresholds for the week. Not every week is going to have a lactic threshold run. We've talked about previously that's an important workout, but not a critical workout. But typically 8 to 10% of my miles I want to come from lactic threshold in a week. VO2 max aerobic power. This is critical. If I don't have any VO2 max aerobic power workouts in a week, that's a problem. The peripheral VO2 max is being lacking. I try and shoot between 5 and 8%, especially with your lesser trained people. It's probably going to be on the lower end of things, but certainly not more than 8%. I get to 8%, I get to 10% with lactic threshold, but I would definitely not want to exceed it. That's definitely a danger zone if you start to get to it. And then strength runs, I'm looking for 1 to 5%. And some weeks when I have both fly 30s and hills, it's going to be at 5%. If I only have, say, fly 30s, it's probably only going to be 1% because that's a low amount of running in the week. So that is my guide. Make your own guide however you want to do it, but that's as I look through everything and what I think is important for most runners. So how can we put this into practice? This will obviously be from my guide of a ratio, and I'm taking, it says 2 macrocycles here, but microcycles, but it's actually going to end up being 3. I'm going to show you it on a couple different slides here. Pulled from the general preparation fictitious, totally made up general preparation phase calendar that I showed you in the part 1 of this video. Basically what I did was I went through and I took the second week of June, the second week of July, and the second week of August to kind of show you how miles kind of go up, but the ratio can still kind of keep on point, at least from the way I do it. You can do it however you want, but the way that I kind of do this, and it might be something to kind of help you out as a guide as you put what's right for you into place. So here is mid-June, recovery run of 30 to 35 minutes. It's going to be about 4 miles at this point of the season. You saw on the previous side, I always kind of color coordinate aerobic threshold as green, tempo as yellow, VO2 max as blue, and anything faster as red. It's just how it breaks down in my mind. I just always color coordinate it like that. So that's the reason. It means nothing more than that. VO2 max is going to be 2 miles for the VO2 max test, and then 2 mile cooldown. So we've got 2 and 2 here. Recovery run of 45 minutes, about 6 miles, all green aerobic threshold. Tempo run of 20 to 25 minutes, going to be about 4 miles at this point. That is going to be yellow for tempo running. And then 2 mile cooldown on the back end, so another 2 for the green part, aerobic threshold. Another recovery run, 35 to 40 minutes this time. That is 5 miles of green aerobic threshold. A long run of 60 to 65%, that is 8 miles. And then short hill intervals, do about 6 of them at this point. It'll end up being, if you do it about 200 meters is what I advocate for, about that or close to that. It's going to be 0.75 of a mile if you do 6 of them with 2 miles on the back end. Obviously, that's not the full miles because you've got warm-ups and active recoveries on, like, say, the hill intervals and things like that. It ends up being 40 miles a week, truly, when you break down the whole workout itself as you're looking at it. So, if you go and add all this up, not only the green that you have here, but also the miles that are not included, aerobic threshold and other miles is going to break down to 33.25 miles total. Okay, so again, the 4 plus 2, 6, 2, 5, 8, and 2 is not going to get you to 33.25, but again, you've got warm-ups on some of the days, like this day you've got a warm-up, tempo run you're doing a warm-up, the short hill intervals you're doing a warm-up, and you're doing active recovery, so that's where the other miles are coming from that aren't accounted for, that aren't highlighted in green. If you take 33.25 divided by 40, that's going to be 83% of the miles this day are going to be aerobic threshold, type running, long, slow distance, however you want to call it, easy pace running for your central VO2 max development, as well as a little bit of running economy. Lactic threshold, 4 miles, we divide 4 by 40, 10%, that's right on the top end of your range. I wouldn't want to do any more than that at this point in the season based on the ratio of total miles per week and using Dr. Jack Daniels' breakdown for what he thinks sort of makes sense for this too. So we're right on the top end for here. So we've got aerobic power. We're only doing 2 miles. Aerobic power is always going to be lower on weeks that you're doing a test because you're only doing 2 miles. In this case, it's on the slowest or lowest end of the range. 2 divided by 40, you're getting 5%. That's on the low end of the range, but still it's perfectly fine, especially at this point of the season. And then SR strength run, 0.75 divided by 40, we're going to get, it's roughly 2% of your weekly volume. So this all sort of adds up. You got, you know, we said 1 to 5% here. We said 5 to 8% here. We said about 8 to 10% here. And then 75 to 85% here. June kind of checks out as we kind of go through all of those different things. There's nothing that's out of the realm of being in the safe range. Like I said, aerobic power is maybe a little bit low on this one, but that's perfectly fine. As we see in July, it'll sort of make up for it when you do more of your interval type workouts. So let's look at our next microcycle. We'll look at July here now. This is going to be the second week of July from our made-up macrocycle from that we looked at in part 1. So we still have a recovery run here on day 1 of this week. 45 minutes at this point. By July, that should be the norm. It'll be about 6 miles at this point. This week, we're going to do VO2 max intervals. This time, about times 5, 1,200, especially for your top-end group. That ends up being 3.75 miles of aerobic power VO2 max work and 3 miles of a cooldown. We've got a recovery run here also, 45 minutes again, so we're at 6 of aerobic threshold. Through the long run in here on week 4 for this week, we're at 90 minutes or 12 miles this time. We're in June, we were at 65 minutes or 8 miles. This week we have fly 30s, alactic times 10. That's about a half a mile. It's actually a little bit less. When I look at alactic work, I'm thinking about the fly-in, the actual rep of 30, and the deceleration, because it's all sort of part and parcel. It's just under a half a mile, but it's close enough. When we're doing the short hills here, it was 0.75. At this point in July, we're doing a 4-mile cooldown so that the volume does not slip on these days. We've got another recovery run of 45 minutes, 6 miles, so we've got 3 of those in this microcycle. And the tempo run now has stepped up to 25 to 30 minutes, or 5 miles, with still that 2-mile cooldown on the back end. The total volume for this fictitious mid-July microcycle is 55 miles. So if we break this all down again, the highlighted green aerobic threshold as well as the other or ancillary miles from warm-ups and active recoveries, we've got 45.75 miles. When we divide that by 55, amazingly enough, it ended up being exactly 83%. Just a little behind the curtain here, I actually did everything for this after I'd already come through and made that whole video, so it's just kind of nice that it all makes, when it works out that way, we're 83%. As I said, typically when I go and I look at all of my weeks after I've gone and made the whole general preparation phase or macrocycle, then I go and I do this breakdown of it. Typically this is where I fall, right in this, you know, low to mid 80% range for aerobic threshold running. Now we've got a lactic threshold run, 5 miles. Now we're at 55 miles, so we'll divide 5 by 55, and it's 9%, so we're still good there, between 8 and 10%. Aerobic power work, 3.75 VO2 max divided by 55. We've got 7%. We said we want anywhere between 5 and 8%, so good. We're a little bit more on the top end of this type of work. And then our strength type runs, this time it's a little bit less. So we check all those off. The strength run is a little bit less, 0.5. We're going to divide that by 55. That's obviously going to be 5%. Don't even really have to grab a calculator for that one. But that still checks out because we said 1 to 5%. So it's not less than that. We're still in that range. And like I said, that's going to fluctuate as you're doing it. But the idea being is here now, even in July, the volume has gone up. But we've increased the ratio of everything in a smart way, too, to account for that. So it's not just, we're still doing, you know, this was a test run, but we're not just doing 2 miles of VO2 max intervals. We're not still doing 4 miles here, okay? Things are being changed around in an actual smart ratio so that we're getting what we need. We've got more total volume, so we can do different amounts of this different work as we're doing it. So that's how that starts to work out. So moving on here now, I'm going to leave the mid-July microcycle off to the left to compare to this one that we're going to be looking at here in August. Again, this is the second week of August. Actually, it's the first full week in August because it starts sort of like right in the middle. So let's see how this sort of breaks down. This would be the second to last week in general prep in our fictitious macrocycle. We still have a recovery run of 45 minutes. That's sort of, I think that's the best distance for recovery runs once you're sort of in shape. So 6 miles. Medium hill intervals, I haven't done a video on this yet. I will as we get out of all these videos on different types of things to talk about with general prep. That's our transitionary workout, times 5. This is typically about 400 meters when you're doing this medium hill interval, so we're dealing with 1.25 miles today of this sort of specific strength work, and a 3-mile cooldown. Long run, we're still at 12 miles here, so nothing changed. Alactic fly 30s, we're still doing times 10, so that is exactly the same of 0.5, but now we've got 2 strength runs in the same week, so it's going to change our ratio. We've got a tempo and a 4-mile cooldown. We've got a tempo run. It's the same tempo run that we did here. 5 miles with 2 miles on the back end. They've obviously gotten faster as they've improved their fitness and their VO2 max testing. Recovery run of 6 miles here, 45 minutes. And now we have another VO2 max test. And this is where things are going to be a little bit tricky with this week. And I think it's I picked this week for a reason also. We have to do a new VO2 max test. So you have to do this regularly to keep all the paces on point. 2 miles at aerobic power with 4 miles on the back end. You can't do more than this on this day, and you can't do 2 of these workouts in the same week. I've talked about this in the VO2 max interval video. It's in the description down below. Total miles is 56. We were 55 here, so that's same type of thing. So let's see how it all breaks down. Aerobic threshold in other miles is going to be 47.25%. Divide that by 56, we get 84%. We're still in the right range of this. It's a little bit on the more high end, but it's still in the right range. Lactic threshold, 5 miles. It's still basically 9%. It's like 8.9% or something like that. So we're in the right range for lactic threshold here for this week. Here's where things get tricky. You have to do your VO2 max test. You have to get this in. But it's going to mean that your volume for this type of workout is light on this week, and there's just no 2 ways about it. Aerobic power, 2 miles divided by 56. We are at 3.5%. That is out of the range for my own ratio as we are looking at it. Strength run, 1.75 miles divided by 56. We got 3%. We're A-OK there. So as we look at these 3 weeks, we only had 1 X mark of these key indicator workouts that we're dealing with here that was out of the range. It was 1 week because it was an aerobic power or a VO2 max test. That's pretty good. It's not going to be perfect every single time you go through. I know I have to do, if I were doing this workout plan, a VO2 max test around this time for whatever reason as we were kind of planning it out. And I can't get greedy. This might be a little bit low this week just because of the total miles and everything that's going on here. So that's important. There is going to be some time when it's not going to be perfect, but if you're most of the time on point, you're probably going to be okay. So that's kind of leading us into these key points and takeaways that I hope you can take from this presentation. Mileage in general prep is a 2-part problem to solve. We looked at the first part of this in part 1 of this. You need to find the right total mileage. That was part 1 video, and need to find the right ratio. That's we dealt with here in part 2. Be careful to not rely on easy miles during this time only. It's really easy to do that, especially during general prep, the summer part of your cross-country season. Easy miles at aerobic threshold are going to be the bulk of your miles, absolutely, to improve central VO2 max, but you need to find room for your tempo runs to develop running economy, among other things, VO2 max aerobic power to develop that peripheral VO2 max, and specific strength to develop force production and muscle characteristics important to cross-country success. Whatever guide for total miles or mileage ratio you decide on, okay, don't just use mine, make what's right for you. You can certainly build off of it, but make sure it's right for your situation. Use it as just that. It's a guide. It's to help you get to the right point. Not every week will be perfect. We just saw one like that, but I'm perfectly fine with that because I knew I had a specific why for that week. I knew my why for that week as I was going through it, so I was comfortable with that particular metric, VO2 max, being a little bit off for that week, okay? But if you have a specific why when you're trying to accomplish as you're doing it, you're probably going to stay on the right track. So that is really sort of the important pieces to kind of look at that when you're dealing with mileage in general prep, not just total miles, but also finding the right ratio. So if you like this video, please think about hitting that subscribe button as we talked about before. If you found this helpful, please share it around. Please do hit that like button and that subscribe button if you found this at all helpful. It really does help the channel. Recommends it to other people that are looking for this type of topics. I do about 3 to 5 videos per week on different aspects of running. Coming up, I'm looking at doing a video on off days, how many, how often, that kind of thing in general prep. Also a video on strength type of things you could also be doing this time of year. And then we'll start transitioning to looking at some other things in terms of planning out your cross-country macrocycle. So until next time, this has been Coachy TV.